Margaret Dawson, a retired teacher and dedicated community volunteer, is mistakenly arrested due to a misidentification in a jewelry store burglary case. Despite her strong denial, she faces harsh interrogations and a flawed justice system that prioritizes assumptions over evidence. Urged to take a plea deal, Margaret refuses, determined to prove her innocence. With resilience, she studies legal principles and defends herself in court, exposing inconsistencies in the prosecution's case. The community rallies behind her, and as the trial unfolds, it becomes clear that she was wrongfully accused. The judge ultimately rules in her favor, leading to internal police reforms and greater awareness of legal injustices. Margaret transforms her ordeal into a movement for change, advocating for fair treatment and inspiring future generations to challenge systemic flaws. Old woman was handcuffed. The sound of metal clamping around her frail wrists reverberated in the cool, early morning air as Margaret Dawson stood silently on the cracked pavement outside her modest apartment in Willow Creek. She had been on her usual path to the community center, a place she had served for decades as a volunteer, when a sudden burst of sirens and flashing red and blue lights shattered the quiet of her routine. Uniformed officers, their expressions stern and unyielding, had mistaken her for a suspect. As the cold metal bit into her skin, a deep sense of disbelief and humiliation washed over her. Margaret, a 73-year-old retired teacher known for her gentle demeanor and tireless commitment to her neighbors, had spent her life nurturing others' futures. Now, in a single inexplicable moment, she found herself cast as a criminal in a case she knew nothing about. The subsequent hours merged into a blur of harsh interrogation rooms, impersonal paperwork, an unremitting justice system that seemed determined to make an example of her rather than to search for the truth. At the Willow Creek police station, where the fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over bleak walls, officers relentlessly questioned her. They insisted that grainy security footage from a local jeweler's store showed a figure matching her description near the scene of a burglary. Margaret's account, however, was resolute. She had left her apartment that morning carrying only a small handbag, intent on reaching the community center for her weekly volunteer session. There was no chance she had strayed anywhere near that jeweler's store. Yet the authorities clung to the video evidence, a dim, indistinct recording that showed a figure draped in a worn shawl and a threadbare coat, features that they claimed bore an uncanny resemblance to her. Inside that cold room, as questions piled up and her calm explanations were met with disbelief, Margaret's memories of a long career dedicated to education and fairness surged through her mind. Each recollection of the respect she'd earned from students and colleagues now contrasted painfully with the harsh treatment she was enduring. Though her voice remained steady, each word was laced with sorrow at the injustice of it all. The officer's accusations, based on mere assumptions and a misinterpreted image, painted a picture of guilt that had little to do with her actual life. Initially, Margaret's public defender, Mr. Johnson Hale, a man whose weary eyes betrayed years of witnessing similar miscarriages of justice, had urged her to accept a plea deal. He argued that pleading guilty might spare her further humiliation and the long, draining process of a trial. But Margaret, whose inner resolve had been honed by decades of fighting for what was right in the classroom and in her community, refused to let herself be defined by a mistake she did not commit. Despite the physical ache from the handcuffs and the mental exhaustion from repeated interrogations, she resolved to fight for her dignity and clear her name. That night, in the dim light of her small room at a local senior center where she was temporarily staying, Margaret sat at a rickety table and began poring over outdated legal textbooks from the center's modest library. The pages, yellowed by time, recounted principles of criminal procedure, the burden of proof, and the importance of challenging evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. With trembling fingers, she traced the lines of text that reminded her that it was the prosecution's duty to prove guilt, not hers to prove innocence. Every legal principle she relearned became a lifeline, a beacon of hope that she could still reclaim her life from a system that had so carelessly condemned her. The trial that followed was a whirlwind of tension and scrutiny. In the packed courtroom, where every eye was fixed on the elderly defendant, Judge Victoria Monroe presided with a calm yet piercing authority. The prosecution, led by the sharp and unsympathetic Miss Catherine Briggs, presented a narrative that Margaret was indeed the culprit, a narrative built on shaky evidence and the testimony of Sergeant Richard Nolan, a veteran officer who had been instrumental in her arrest. Nolan recounted the morning's events with unwavering certainty, describing how his team had observed a small, large, elderly figure near the jewelry store. His testimony leaned heavily on the grainy surveillance footage and on assumptions drawn from a vague description, but as Nolan spoke, inconsistencies began to surface, and his certainty wavered when pressed on details that only added to confusion. Margaret's presence in the courtroom was a study in dignified defiance. With a measured pace that belied her years, she rose to speak on her own behalf. Her voice, though soft, resonated powerfully as she addressed the judge and jury. "Your Honor," she began, "I stand before you not as a criminal, but as a woman who has devoted her life to serving this community. I was not near that jewelry store on the morning in question. I was en route to the community center, where I have volunteered for over 30 years. The evidence presented is circumstantial and, upon closer examination, fails to meet the standard of proof required by law." Her words, deliberate and clear, forced everyone in the courtroom to confront the stark disparity between the life she had led and the charge now leveled against her. Margaret systematically dismantled the prosecution's case. She questioned the reliability of the security footage, pointing out that the low resolution made it nearly impossible to identify anyone with certainty. "A blurry image," she said, "cannot serve as a reliable indicator of guilt. How can we trust a recording that fails to capture even the most basic details?" She further noted that the measurements indicated in the video showed a suspect whose physical stature did not align with her own, information that several community members could readily corroborate. At the same time, the defense introduced records showing that Sergeant Nolan had been the subject of several disciplinary complaints in the past, suggesting that his judgment in making arrests might have been compromised by bias or error. The courtroom grew hushed as Judge Monroe examined the documents and evidence presented by the defense. The atmosphere shifted palpably. What had begun as an almost predetermined verdict of guilt began to fracture under the weight of Margaret's compelling arguments. With each pointed question she posed, it became increasingly evident that the prosecution's case was built on a foundation of assumptions rather than hard evidence. Margaret's clarity and unwavering resolve transformed the proceedings from mere legal formality into a powerful statement against injustice. Outside the courtroom, the people of Willow Creek rallied around Margaret. Neighbors, former students, and local activists flooded social media and community forums with support, demanding accountability for the blatant mishandling of her case. Their collective voice underscored a growing sense of indignation that a respected elder, an embodiment of the town's heart and soul, could be so callously treated. Meetings were held in community halls and church basements, where citizens vowed that no one else should have to endure such a travesty of justice. Throughout the trial, Margaret maintained her resolve, even as the ordeal wore on her frail body and tested her spirit. Each night, after exhausting days spent in court and in study, she would return to her small room at the senior center, where she continued to review legal texts and prepare for every possible challenge. Despite the physical aches that accompanied her advanced age, her mind remained as sharp as it had ever been, a testament to a lifetime dedicated to learning and service. In those solitary hours, she recalled the lessons of fairness and perseverance she had imparted to countless students, drawing strength from the belief that every person deserved to be treated with dignity. A turning point came when Margaret's defense called for a full review of the security footage. During this critical moment, the defense questioned Sergeant Nolan about the procedures used to measure the suspect's height, a detail that had been cited as key evidence by the prosecution. Caught off guard by the scrutiny, Nolan faltered, his earlier confidence giving way to uncertainty. The inconsistencies in his testimony and the lack of clear, verifiable data in the video undermined the prosecution's entire argument. It became apparent that the evidence, rather than confirming Margaret's guilt, only served to cast profound doubt on the validity of the investigation. Judge Monroe, visibly moved by the unfolding revelations, eventually delivered her verdict with measured finality. "The evidence presented does not meet the burden required for conviction," she pronounced, her voice echoing through the silent courtroom. In that instant, a collective sigh of relief swept over those who had come to see Margaret not as a criminal, but as a pillar of their community unjustly targeted by a flawed system. Moreover, The judge ordered that an internal investigation be launched into the conduct of Sergeant Nolan, signaling a commitment to uncovering the truth behind a wrongful arrest. In the days that followed the trial, as the gavel's echo receded into memory, Margaret embarked on a slow journey toward healing. The ordeal had left indelible marks on her spirit, a mixture of sorrow, anger, and cautious hope. Yet even as she struggled with the lingering trauma of that fateful day, she found solace in the outpouring of support from her community. The local media covered her story extensively, portraying her not as a miscreant but as a courageous soul who had stood up against a system rife with prejudice. Town meetings, vigils, and heartfelt letters filled her mailbox, each one a reminder that her struggle had sparked a movement for change. In the quiet moments that followed each sunrise, as Margaret sat by the window watching the gentle awakening of Willow Creek, she reflected on her long life, a life filled with the triumphs and trials of teaching, of nurturing young minds, and of advocating for what was right. Those memories now intertwined with the painful experience of her wrongful arrest, forming a tapestry that was both beautiful and bittersweet. Determined not to allow this injustice to define her, she resolved to use her newfound voice to champion reform. At community centers and local libraries, she began to speak about her experience, urging others to educate themselves about their rights and to hold authorities accountable. Her words, imbued with decades of wisdom and the quiet strength of a life well lived, resonated deeply with everyone who listened. Mr. Jonathan Hale, once resigned to the notion of a quick plea deal, transformed his approach after witnessing Margaret's unwavering determination. Inspired by her example, he became an outspoken advocate for legal reform, offering pro bono services to those wrongfully accused and helping to establish a legal aid fund dedicated to protecting the rights of the vulnerable. This fund, created in honor of Margaret's tenacity, soon became a vital resource for many in Willow Creek and the surrounding region, a lasting legacy of one woman's fight for justice. Even within the police department, the fallout from Margaret's case brought about a moment of reckoning. The internal investigation into Sergeant Nolan spurred a series of reforms aimed at ensuring that future arrests were conducted with greater care and adherence to proper protocol. Mandatory training sessions on bias-improved procedures for verifying evidence and the introduction of body cameras for all officers gradually restored a measure of public trust. While not everyone was quick to embrace these changes, the transformation that began in the wake of Margaret's trial signaled a new era in the town's approach to law enforcement. In the quiet sanctuary of her modest home, Margaret often found herself revisiting the painful memories of that day. The sound of the handcuffs, the cold glare of interrogation lights, the hollow feeling of being reduced to a suspect. Yet she also remembered the quiet moments of defiant strength that followed, the long nights spent poring over legal texts, the supportive nods from neighbors, the steady gaze she maintained in the courtroom even as injustice reared its head. Each recollection reinforced her belief that every person, no matter how old or frail, possessed an inner strength capable of challenging even the most formidable systems. With time, Margaret's struggle evolved into a beacon for others. Her memoir, penned in careful, deliberate script, chronicled the injustice she had endured and the lessons learned from her battle for truth. In public readings held at a community center, her account was met with tears, applause, and the quiet resolve of those who had long suffered in silence. The memoir, while deeply personal, captured a universal truth about the power of perseverance and the importance of standing up for one's rights. It became a cherished document, a reminder that even in the twilight of life, the courage to confront injustice could ignite a movement for change. In every conversation that followed, every town hall meeting, and every whisper exchange on the streets of Willow Creek, Margaret Dawson's name came to symbolize more than just a wrongful arrest. It embodied the enduring human spirit, the collective will to demand accountability, and the belief that justice, true, uncompromised justice, was worth fighting for regardless of one's age. As the seasons changed and the scars of the past began to fade into memory, the legacy of that painful day remained a potent reminder that the strength of a community was measured not by the ease with which it dismissed its vulnerable, but by the determination with which it protected them. In the soft light of early evening, as the sun dipped behind the rolling hills that bordered the town, Margaret would sit on her favorite bench in the town square and watch as the sun dipped behind the rolling hills that bordered the town. Margaret would sit on her favorite bench in the town square and watch as the people of Willow Creek moved about their lives. Her eyes, though lined with the traces of hardship, shone with a quiet, unyielding fire, a testament to the fact that even in a system designed to break the spirit, one determined soul could spark a revolution, a hope in change. With each gentle breath, each measured step along the familiar sidewalks, she carried a memory of that day as both a burden and a call to action, a reminder that her struggle had not been in vain. And so, as night fell softly over Willow Creek, Margaret Dawson's journey continued, a journey not defined by the handcuffs that had once restrained her, but by the boundless courage with which she had reclaimed her identity, in the hearts of those who had witnessed her battle, and in the whispered conversations of the townspeople. Her story lived on as a symbol of resilience, a quiet revolution against the forces of injustice. Every word she spoke, every lesson she shared, was a challenge to a system that had once failed her, a challenge to never again let the vulnerable be silenced. In that enduring spirit, as the final rays of daylight surrendered to a peaceful twilight, Margaret knew that her fight was not just for herself, but for every person who had ever felt powerless in the face of authority. And in that knowledge, there was a measure of comfort, a quiet, steadfast assurance that the legacy of her struggle would inspire generations to come, ensuring that the scales of justice, though sometimes tipped by error, would ultimately find their balance in truth and compassion.